Hello everyone, welcome to Full Moon Movies. There are horror films that frighten us with monsters, ghosts, and supernatural forces. And then there are films like Obsession, where the real horror comes from something much closer to everyday life, the desire to be loved, and what happens when that desire becomes a need to possess another person. Written and directed by Curry Barker, Obsession premiered in 2025 before receiving its wider theatrical release in 2026. And what initially appears to be a relatively simple supernatural horror story has become one of the most surprising audience and box office success of recent years. At the center of the film are Bear, played by Michael Johnston, and Nikki, played brilliantly by Indy Navarrete. Bear is a shy young man hopelessly in love with his childhood friend Nikki, but rather than accepting that she may never feel the same way, he breaks the mysterious one wish willow and wishes that Nikki would love him more than anyone else in the world. And of course, he gets exactly what he asked for, but certainly not in the way he imagined. Now, what makes Obsession particularly effective is how recognizable this situation initially feels. Bear isn't introduced as a conventional horror villain. He's awkward, lonely, and convicted that if Nikki could somehow recognize how much she cares for her, she would realize that he is the person she should be with. Now, this idea of the supposedly decent, nice guy waiting for women to recognize his value has become particularly familiar in contemporary dating culture and social media discussions. Now, this supernatural element simply takes that mentality to its horrifying conclusion. Bear doesn't actually ask Nikki to understand him. In fact, he takes away her ability to choose. And that becomes one of the film's most interesting observations about relationships. Love isn't valuable simply because someone loves you intensely. Love has meaning because another person has freely chosen to give it to you. By using the one wish below, Bear gets the relationship he believes he wants, but he destroys the very quality that made Nikki attractive to him in the first place. Her independence as another human being is one of them. Now, one critic described the film's central insight in similar terms. Forcing someone to love you ultimately, in fact, strips away the qualities that made them a person who wanted to love. This is where indie narrative becomes absolutely essential to the movie. A performance gradually transforms Nikki from someone recognizable and independent into something interestingly disturbing. Her affection initially appears almost flattering. She wants to spend time with Bear, she wants his attention, she wants to be physically close to him, but gradually that affection becomes suffocating. Love becomes dependency, dependency becomes jealousy, and jealousy becomes possession. Navarrete has to move between romance, comedy, vulnerability, and outright horror, sometimes within the same sequence, and she gives the film much more of its unsettling energy. The relationship between Bear and Nikki, therefore, becomes an exaggerated reflection of behaviors that younger audiences encounter constantly in discussions about modern relationships such as ghosting, rejection, jealousy, emotional dependency, boundaries, consent, and the expectation that another person should somehow complete you. Now, this may help to explain why the film has connected so strongly with younger viewers, especially in larger population countries like India. Critics have specifically noted that Barker himself, a filmmaker in his 20s, appears to be speaking directly to the Gen Z and contemporary interpersonal anxieties. There is also something refreshing about how straightforward the concept is. For example, Obsession doesn't require an enormous mythology or 20 minutes of exposition explaining the supernatural rules. The premise could almost be reduced to a single question: what if you could make the person you love fall completely in love with you? Now, most romantic movies would treat that as a fantasy. Obsession treats it as a nightmare. And I think that's one reason the film works so well with contemporary audiences. Now, beneath all that blood and supernatural horror is an extremely simple relationship question that almost everyone can understand. If someone only loves you because you are forced them to, now can you really call that love? But there is also another side to the film that I think deserves discussion, particularly when we consider gender stereotypes. Initially, Obsession can clearly be interpreted as a critique of male entitlement. Bear believes that because he loves Nikki, somehow he deserves to be loved in return. His wish violates Nikki's autonomy and transforms her into the fulfillment of his romantic fantasy. Now, that consequences therefore becomes a punishment for his decisions to control another person's feeling. Barker has discussed a story that critics have interpreted through ideas of male entitlement and non consensual relationships, and some commentary has even described the movie through the provocative label of incel horror. But the movie becomes more complicated once Nikki becomes the obsessive partner. Suddenly, Bear becomes frightened of the very behavior he originally wished for. Nikki becomes possessive. She refuses boundaries. Her desire becomes controlling and eventually threatening. Bear discovers what it means to have another person decide that their feelings are more important than your freedom. And now, this creates an interesting reversal. If these behaviors were being performed by a male character towards a woman, constant monitoring, extreme jealousy, and refusing rejection or controlling behavior, and unwanted physical or emotional attention, we would immediately recognize many of them as a warning signs of an abusive relationship. Now, when the genders are reversed, however, audiences may initially interpret some of the same behavior differently. Now, this is where I think Obsession accidentally or perhaps deliberately opens another conversation. Male victims of controlling relationships are not always portrayed seriously in popular culture. Sometimes an obsessive woman is presented as funny, sexually desirable, or simply crazy. Obsession takes those behaviors and pushes them into horror. Bear becomes afraid of Nikki, and the audience is expected to understand that fear. There has been some online criticism arguing that the film's framing risks encouraging audiences to concentrate heavily on Bear's original wrongdoing while giving less attention to the fact that he subsequently experiences stalking, coercion, and abuse. I wouldn't necessarily say the movie endorses that double standard. In fact, I think its gender reversal can really expose it. The important point is neither character's gender changes the principle involved. Affection without consent becomes control, and control can become abuse. Now, at the same time, Bear cannot simply be transformed into an innocent victim as well. Everything that follows originates from his decision to remove Nikki's choice. Now, that moral complication is precisely what makes the film more interesting. The movie doesn't need us to choose Team Bear or Team Nikki. Both sides demonstrate different manifestations of the same underlying problem, that the belief that love gives one person ownership over another. And audiences have clearly responded to this mixture of horror and relationship commentary. As of early August 2026, Obsession has an extraordinary 94% critic score and 94% verified audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, that is based on more than 300 critic reviews and over 10,000 verified audience rating. The site's critics' consensus praises the movie for transforming its disturbing premise into something simultaneously unsettling, entertaining, and thrilling, while audience reaction has particularly highlighted Navrati's performance and the film's mixture of grotesque horror and dark humor. But perhaps the biggest surprise has been the box office. According to the numbers, Obsession has earned approximately 458.9 million worldwide, including around 261.6 million domestically and 197.2 million internationally. Even more astonishing is the reported production budget of only around 1 million. Now that represents an extraordinary theatrical return for a small original horror production without an established franchise behind it. Now that success is important because Obsession isn't another sequel or remake or superhero property. It demonstrates that audiences can still respond enormously to the original concept when the idea is really simple, relatable, and executed effectively. Its international performance also suggests that the central idea translates easily across cultures. Like what I said, it was a really big hit in India. Now, you don't really need to understand American politics or complicated mythology to understand unrequited love, jealousy, and the desire to be wanted. The film's visual identity also helps to distinguish it from more polished studio horrors because Baker comes from a generation of filmmakers influenced by YouTube and internet culture. Yet the movie embraces tactile, sometimes almost analog imagery rather than making everything appear digitally perfect. Recent commentary on the contemporary horror has identified this attraction to older technology and imperfect analog textures as particularly appealing to young filmmakers and Gen Z audiences. From home cinema collectors, that atmosphere also what it really makes Obsession an interesting title for a 4K UHD. This isn't necessarily the kind of film where you're looking for enormous landscapes or spectacular CGI, but much of its visual effectiveness comes from darkness, faces, interiors, and shadows. A strong 4K presentation can really preserve those subtle gradations in darker scenes and allow the cinematography to retain its deliberately unsettling texture. Combined with an immersive soundtrack and quiet moments become just as important as the more violent sequences because we are constantly waiting for Nikki's affection to cross another boundary. In conclusion, I think Obsession has become such a phenomenon because underneath its supernatural premise is something extremely contemporary. It is about a generation of navigating relationships in an environment where desire, loneliness, rejection, jealousy, and validation are constantly amplified through technology and social media. Bear thinks his problem is that Nikki doesn't really love him. But the film gradually reveals that this was never really the problem. His problem is believing that love is something he should be able to obtain rather than something another person must freely give. And when Nikki becomes obsessed with him, the film turns the same lesson back onto Bear. He discovers that being desperately wanted isn't necessarily romantic, sometimes it is frightening. Now, that is why Obsession works as more than simply another supernatural horror movie. It begins with male entitlement, transforms into a story where a man experiences controlling and abusive behavior from a woman, and ultimately it arrives at something much more universal that love without choice isn't love at all. Now, considering its extraordinary audience reception, a remarkable box office performance, and the conversations it has generated around consent, relationships, and gender expectations, Obsessions may eventually be remembered as one of those rare low budget horror movies that captures exactly what its generation was thinking about at that time. And perhaps the most frightening thing about the One Wish Willow isn't that it grants you wish, it's that it gives you exactly what you thought you wanted. Now, this movie is a must watch.